Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on educational inequality. The learning goals and questions this chapter aims to answer are the following. What are the dimensions of racial inequality in our educational system? How important is the historical legacy of unequal educational opportunities? And how can we explain the continuing gap in the educational achievements of white, Asian, Black, Native American, and Latino students? We begin with a history of school segregation experienced by various different racial and ethnic groups, beginning with the various different kinds of Indian schools that existed. These were segregated schools, many were boarding schools created to assimilate Native children. The US government created these schools to encourage Native Americans to leave behind the traditional ways and assimilate. One of these schools was the Carlisle Indian School, which was founded in 1979. The founder's philosophy, which was to kill the Indian and save the man, epitomizes what the goal of these schools was. Students who tried to run away were harshly punished. Children were given American names, their haircuts, and American forms of dress, and were indoctrinated into Christianity. These schools existed until 1993. A number of them were enclosed until then. And the long-term effects of these schools includes generational trauma and the inability of these children being able to re-enter their Native communities. And we saw some examples of that in the reading. There's also a history of segregated schooling for Chinese, Mexican, and African American students. There are instances and examples throughout the country of all having attended segregated schools. Schools for Mexican Americans were designed to Americanize them through instruction in cooking, hygiene, English, and civics. Children were punished for speaking Spanish. Girls were taught home economics so that they could work in the homes of white people as domestic workers. We, of course, know of the segregation of African American schools, many of them which had minimal funding. So again, this is sort of this long history of educational inequality that has existed in this country. We see the end of legal segregation starting to take place in the late 40s, and of course in 1954 with the Brown versus Board of Education case, which found that segregation of African-American children was unconstitutional. But before this case, we had the Mendes versus Westminster case in 1947 in California, which found that segregation of Latino children was unconstitutional. And this case actually served as a precedent for the Brown versus Board of Education case. However, we also saw in the reading that there was significant resistance by the white population to these cases and these new regulations about integrating schools. One example was in Prince Edward County in Virginia, where the Brown versus Board of Education case was responded to by the local population by closing all public schools. So people actually prefer to not send their children to school than to have them go to school with children of color. So why does segregation persist today if these laws against segregation have been passed? In 1968, 40% of Mexican origin students in Texas were attending schools that were 80% or more Mexican. In 2001, 40% of Latino students and 31% of Black students in the South attended schools that were less than 10% white. So we see this persistence of segregation existing still within the school system. In 1971, in the case Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, the US Supreme Court ruled that federal courts could order school districts to rezone schools and bus students to achieve desegregation. School districts that were ordered to desegregate did so, and schools were integrated. These measures led to positive outcomes for Black students in integrated schools. Their graduation rates increased, as did their post-secondary school earnings, and their incarceration rates decreased. However, in 1991, the Supreme Court decided in Dowell versus Oklahoma City that schools are not obligated to desegregate. So the schools were released from court oversight And once that took place, we see once again a return to high levels of segregation. Another area in which we see racial diversity and integration being an issue is at the university level. The Baki case in 1978 found that schools were not allowed to use racial quotas, but could continue to use race as a factor in admissions decisions, right? And so what we see at the university level is the use of affirmative action as a law, and that came through Title VI in 1968 of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which enabled colleges and universities to take affirmative action to enhance racial diversity on campus. In schools with affirmative action programs, admissions committees can consider the racial diversity of applicants as one factor in their decision to admit a student to a university. And this has been upheld through the various court challenges to affirmative action and admissions policies. We saw that in the Baki case in 1978, where it was found that you could not have racial quotas, but you could still use race as a factor in the process of admissions. In the Fisher case, which is a more recent case in 2016, the Supreme Court reaffirmed that the University of Texas has the right to take racial status into consideration in university admissions. This factor is one of many considered, including grades, test scores, extracurricular activities, hardship, and other personal characteristics. This particular case came to the Supreme Court when the student Abigail Fisher, who is white, filed a lawsuit alleging that her denial of admission to the University of Texas was due to her race. However, as we saw in the reading, it was actually her lack of qualifications that resulted in her not being accepted into the university. Now, one of the ways in which we talk about educational inequality is through this concept of the achievement gap, right? And social scientists try to explain why there are these differences among different racial groups in terms of educational achievement. So for instance, here we see the average national assessment of educational progress, reading scale scores of 4th and 8th grade students by race and ethnicity. And so you see here that there is sort of this difference in terms of the scoring between white, Black, Hispanic, Asian Pacific Islander, and American Indian and Alaska Native. And so the question becomes, why aren't these numbers the same across the board, right? We also see educational inequality persisting in terms of graduation rates, where Latinos have the lowest average high school and college graduation rates, as we see here in this particular graph. Inequalities also exist between poor kids and rich kids. And so we see that here in terms of students who are in the low socioeconomic status household. Those are the orange ones, middle versus blue. And we see what their average science scores are for kindergarteners, first graders, and second graders. So you see here a significant gap between those that are in the higher socioeconomic status versus those that are in the lower socioeconomic status. We also see these discrepancies when it comes to SAT scores, correlating with family income. So those that have higher income tend to have higher scores. And we can kind of understand why this would be the case, right? Families that have a higher income, they can afford to get tutors, they can afford to send their children to SAT prep scores, they can afford to send their students to private schools that already have this kind of training built into their curriculum so that they can do well in these kinds of tests. So that kind of income discrepancy carries over to educational outcomes, right? And as we saw previously, there is income inequality between different races, as we see here, And that also has then an impact on the racial discrepancies that we see in terms of education. One of the other things that the reading talked about was this idea of the model minority myth that stereotypes Asians as being inherently more successful than other groups. But what we see in the reading is that when we disaggregate different Asian American groups, we see that there's a lot of variation in terms of their educational success. The reading also talked about this concept of hyperselectivity among immigrant groups. So for example, the reading talked about how Asians do better educationally than whites, but there's a lot of variation. So 70% of South Asian Americans have a bachelor's degree compared to 26% of Vietnamese Americans, and less than 15% for Laotian, Cambodian, and Hmong Americans. The concept of hyperselectivity talks about how what kind of educational background immigrants bring with them to the United States, and how then that creates a discrepancy in terms of educational success in the United States. So in China, only about 4% of adults hold a bachelor's degree or higher. In contrast, 50% of the Chinese immigrants to the United States hold a bachelor's degree or higher. So China's immigration to the United States is hyper-selective in terms of college education. So even though in China itself, 4% of adults hold a bachelor's degree, those that come to the United States represent those that actually have bachelor's degrees. Whereas only 5% of people in Vietnam have college degrees, 23% of Vietnamese immigrants in the United States have college degrees. Both Chinese and Vietnamese immigration is highly selective. However, when looking at other immigrant groups, we see a different situation. People in Mexico are much more likely to have college degrees than people in China, 17% versus 4%. But the Mexican immigrants that come to the United States, only 5% of them have bachelor's degrees or higher. Now, one of the ways in which social scientists try to explain this achievement gap is by using different cultural explanations. One is this idea of oppositional culture, where one sociological thesis is that Black children receive signals from both white and Black communities that lead them to reject schooling as a route to success. This idea of acting white refers to non-white people who are perceived as behaving in ways associated with white people. Sociologists argue that Black students saw being successful in school as acting white, and thus that's why they reject schooling. Research shows, however, that Black students have more positive attitudes toward learning than white students. Black students are more likely to take the ACT or the SAT. They're more likely to contact sources about college. They're more likely to submit college applications, and they have more positive attitudes towards schooling. For example, using a nationally representative sample of nearly 17,000 students, sociologists found that Black students had more positive attitudes towards schools than white students, okay, and found many of these different findings. Blake found that once we consider socioeconomic status and school-related variables, Black students are more likely to take these tests, contact schools about college, and submit college applications. Other reasons that are more consistent to explain this academic gap are discussed in terms of either tracking and academic profiling. Studies have found that teachers are more likely to put white students in college preparatory tracks. Students of color are often tracked away from four-year college students. And so you may often have heard anecdotally of guidance counselors that tell students of color that they should go to the community college, or that they shouldn't aim for a four-year college because they don't have the grades or they don't have the capacity to be able to be successful there. Whereas white students are being told something different by the same guidance counselors. And so that is going to create a discrepancy between which students go to four-year colleges and which students don't, which students go to college at all and which students don't. The reading also talked about cultural and social capital as a way to also discuss, right, some of these achievement gaps. Social capital refers to the relationships and networks that you have, so who you know. Cultural capital refers to cultural resources, what you know. Institutional agents, it refers to a person who occupies a position of power and is able to access or negotiate resources for others. So if you have an institutional agent as a student of color, then that person is looking out for you, right? And is being supportive. Students that do not have the social or cultural capital of dominant knowledge have a disadvantage in educational achievement. Students who, for instance, have access to the dominant cultural capital, the norms, values, and cultural knowledge of the school will have more chance of success. So for example, students that in colleges and universities, for example, if their parents went to college, then they have a certain kind of cultural and social capital. They have a knowledge and a familiarity with how do you register for a class, right? What office did you go to for what, right? You have a better understanding of what college as an institution is about and like, and how to use those resources for you to be able to be successful. First generation college students don't have that kind of cultural and social capital. And so they will tend to struggle a little bit more, particularly the first year, in trying to navigate this new institution, right? That you don't just go to your guidance counselor or the principal's office or your teacher, but that there's all these other different resources, these other different offices. There's these people called deans, right? That you're not familiar with, right? And so that is an example of not having social or cultural capital, right? And how then has an impact on your educational success because you're not quite sure how to navigate this new space, right? The reading also talked about symbolic violence, the power of the dominant group to make its preferences, tastes, and norms appear superior to those of other groups. And one example was in terms of language, where standardized English spoken by middle-class Americans is considered as a marker of intelligence. Another example is the devaluing the cultural knowledge of certain racial ethnic groups. So when you, for instance, are writing a paper and the content is right, you're demonstrating you're understanding the material, but you're not using standard English, this standardized English that's spoken by the middle class, then that's would be an example of symbolic violence, right? Especially if the teacher marks you down in the paper because you're not using this standardized English and are using perhaps more of a vernacular English, or perhaps you have English as in your first language, and so that's going to appear in your writing, right? So a lot of this is what the reading is talking about in terms of symbolic violence, all the different ways in which certain students who don't fit these particular language and cultural knowledge and so on are devalued within school systems. The reading also talked about hidden curricular, where some education scholars argue that there's a hidden curriculum and that the school curriculum is designed to reflect the cultural hegemony and ensure the class interests of the dominant group. So for example, if you are taking history classes in your K-12 education and you never learn about, the histories of different racial ethnic groups, right? Or you only learn about slavery in one small unit, and then you jump to Martin Luther King, as if there was no African Americans in between those two time periods in your history classes. That's an example of a hidden curriculum. So in this chapter, we have explored the various dimensions of educational inequality, and now we have also explored various explanations for the achievement gap. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to seeing your discussion posts. Have a great week.